Since I was a child, my grandmother would often tell me stories about the house she lived in. She always said it was haunted. I never really knew whether to believe her. I often thought they were just typical grandmother stories, meant to pass the time. My grandmother was deeply devout, to the point where she prayed the rosary every single day, without fail. But there was always something unsettling about it, because every time she prayed, strange things would happen. I never witnessed anything myself, but the stories she told felt strangely real. My grandmother was convinced that there was a presence in the house, something that only appeared when she prayed. I always assumed it was just her imagination, maybe due to her age, loneliness, or something similar. But she never wavered in her belief. It's hard to explain, but I knew one thing for certain. My grandmother had never lied to me, not even once. Her first encounter with this presence was something she never forgot. It happened one night while my mother and father were visiting her. The whole family was sleeping, and my grandmother had stayed up to say her nightly rosary. The house was silent, save for the usual sounds of wood creaking and the wind outside. But then as she prayed, she felt a sudden shift in the air, a heavy sensation, like the feeling you get when you realize someone is watching you. But there was no one else in the room. She continued praying, trying to ignore the feeling. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. At first, she thought it was a trick of her failing vision. She suffered from complications due to diabetes, but she swore it was there. It was a shadow, darker and denser than the usual darkness, lingering in the corner of her room. My grandmother froze, unsure whether she should continue praying or try to run. But with her bad knees, running wasn't really an option. So she did the only thing she could think of. She closed her eyes and prayed harder, hoping that when she opened them again, everything would be back to normal. But when she finally dared to open her eyes, the shadow was still there. Only now, it seemed to have come closer. It didn't make a sound. It was just there, observing her silently. My grandmother didn't tell me much more about that particular encounter, except that she eventually stopped looking at it and stared straight ahead, focusing on her prayers. At some point, the shadow vanished. After that night, things were never quite the same. Whenever she prayed, she felt the presence, an eerie sense of being watched. It didn't happen every night, but often enough for her to notice a pattern, and it was always when she was alone, never when others were around. My grandmother didn't stop praying the rosary, but she started doing it during the day or when other people were present. She said it made her feel safer, as if a higher power was urging her to take precautions. The shadow never appeared as clearly as it did that first time, but the sense of something lurking never completely left. As time went on, things grew stranger in the house. Objects would be out of place, or there would be inexplicable noises. The occurrences became more frequent, more disturbing. Eventually, my grandmother had to accept what was happening. It was the rosary itself that somehow attracted the shadow. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for her to make a choice between her faith and peace of mind. In the end, she chose to stop praying the rosary altogether. It was not an easy decision, and she told me many times how much inner conflict it brought her. Her faith was a core part of who she was, but the idea of continually drawing that presence closer was unbearable. I felt a mixture of admiration and sorrow for her. Admiration for the strength it took to make such a decision, and sadness for what she had to sacrifice. I was around 21 years old when strange things began to happen to my mother. She was already older, but still full of energy. Suddenly, she started having dreams that changed her completely. Unlike my grandmother, my mother was never overly religious. She wasn't the type to attend Mass every Sunday. But then, unexpectedly, everything shifted. She began to dream that God was speaking to her, telling her to go to church, and without hesitation, she obeyed. I remember the first time I saw her getting up in the middle of the night. It was 3 a.m., and I had woken up to use the bathroom. I saw her getting dressed as if she were preparing for an important event. "Mom, what are you doing?" I asked, confused. She looked at me with a serious expression, the kind she had when something truly mattered to her. "I have to go to church. I dreamed that God asked me to go," she said simply. I was too sleepy and bewildered to question her, so I just shook my head and went back to bed. But it wasn't just a one-time thing. It became a regular occurrence, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. Each dream felt like a command to her. The church offered masses at midnight and 6 a.m., and she attended them as if her life depended on it. At first, I thought it was just a phase, something temporary, but as weeks passed, it became a routine. One morning during breakfast, I couldn't help but ask her, "Why are these dreams so important to you? Why do you follow them so strictly?" She paused and then looked into my eyes with a seriousness I had never seen before. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of fear in her gaze. "In the dreams, God tells me that if I don't go to church, the devil will take me," she said, her voice leaving no room for doubt. I wasn't sure whether to believe her, but the intensity with which she spoke sent chills down my spine. She fell silent for a moment, as if gathering the courage to continue. Then, in a low, almost whispering voice, she recounted a dream that had left a lasting impact on her. "It started one night when I dreamed that I had to go to Mass at midnight," she began. "I arrived at the church, and it was nearly empty, with only a few people scattered across the pews. I sat down and closed my eyes to pray. But in the middle of my prayer, I felt something strange, a presence drawing near." My mother paused, taking a sip of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. I opened my eyes and saw a man standing right in front of me. He didn't look like an ordinary man. His eyes were deeply black, like bottomless pits. He stared at me, and in that moment, I felt a fear like no other, as if he could see right into my soul. "What did you do then?" I asked, unable to hide my curiosity and concern. "The only thing I could do was pray harder," she continued. And then the man began to speak. His voice was cold and distorted, saying things that made no sense, words in a language I couldn't understand. But the worst part was when he started to laugh. It wasn't a human laugh. It was something sinister, echoing throughout the empty church. She stopped again, her face pale, as if reliving that moment in vivid detail. "That laughter haunted my dreams for a long time," she admitted. At that moment, I realized he wasn't just a man. He was something else, something evil. I felt that if I didn't keep going to church, if I didn't obey the dreams God sent me, something terrible would happen to me. She finished her story, and an eerie silence settled over the kitchen. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as her imagination, but another part, the one that had seen the genuine fear in her eyes, knew there was some truth in her words. After hearing my mother's story, something changed within me. I began to feel a mix of fear and respect for her beliefs. The following week, I watched her continue to attend church with even more fervor. She started praying more often at home and keeping religious images close, as if she were engaged in a constant battle with something unseen. That was the only time we ever discussed those dreams and her experiences at the church. A few years later, my mother passed away peacefully in her bed, as if she had finally found the peace she had been searching for. After her death, I often found myself reflecting on everything she had told me. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered whether she had truly been fighting something real, or if it was all a product of her mind. But every time those thoughts crossed my mind, I remembered the expression in her eyes when she told me her story. It was her fear, raw and undeniable, that made me believe it was real. The village where I grew up was small, housing no more than about 60 people. Everyone knew each other, and we, the 13 children in the village, also knew one another well. We often played together, exploring the surrounding area, as there wasn't much entertainment in that rural part of Ohio in the mid-90s. The village itself was old. The oldest records I could find mentioned it being established in the 1800s. It had only one church at the center, an old school nearby, and a pasture that backed onto dense woods which surrounded 3 sides of the small town. My father had grown up there and was full of tales and legends about the place. One of the stories he often told us was about an old fort, originally French, that later became British and eventually colonial American. Nobody knew exactly where it was located, but there were occasional mentions of the fort in historical documents. It was said to have been a major trading route for local native tribes and the influx of settlers in the area. Naturally, conflicts arose as more people settled around the village, leading to a series of violent confrontations between the colonists and the native tribes. The fort, according to the stories, was destroyed by fire, and many people on both sides were massacred. Eventually, the tribes were driven out of the area with the help of a local militia. My father often warned us that the land was bad, as he put it, cursed by the violent history that had unfolded there. He believed that when entire families were massacred and destroyed, it left a mark on the land itself. Whenever we played in the woods, we were always given 2 warnings. If the forest became silent, we were to leave immediately, and if our names were called while we were there, we were not to answer, but to return home without looking back, pretending we hadn't heard a thing. When I was around 10 years old, I developed an insatiable desire to go camping. It was mid-August, with hot, humid days and cool, pleasant nights. I gathered 2 of my friends and shared the idea, and they were both eager to join. Usually, no one camped in those woods, and our parents weren't keen on the idea of a group of kids aged 10 to 12 camping alone. In the end, my father agreed, but only if he could accompany us to ensure our safety. I agreed, and we set out in search of a good camping spot. I wanted to explore the area beforehand, making sure it was clear of debris and suitable for pitching tents. By that time, I was already familiar with the forest and followed the tradition of making a small offering before entering. I reached a spot near a stream and began preparing it, clearing twigs, removing large stones, and setting up a fire pit. I was so engrossed in the task that I didn't realize how silent everything had become. It was a deathly silence. No birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind. I immediately stopped what I was doing and stood still, scanning the surroundings while trying to slow my breathing, straining to hear the faintest sound. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I heard the distant call of a crow, followed by a soft whistle of the wind through the trees. The hairs on my arms and neck stood on end, but I convinced myself that it was just my imagination and that everything around me was normal. Satisfied with this logical explanation, I returned home to pack for the night. By 6 p.m., my 2 friends had arrived with their tents and backpacks. My father and I were just finishing dinner. The 4 of us gathered our things and headed to the spot I had prepared. Nothing of significance happened at first, even after we set up our tents and lit the campfire. It seemed like it would be a fun and enjoyable night. Around 11 p.m., as we were getting ready to settle into our tents, the wind picked up. My father remarked that it might rain, but he didn't seem pleased, which was odd since he usually loved the rain. It was as if he sensed that something was off. It didn't take long for all of us to start feeling uneasy as well. We positioned our tents in a semicircle around the fire, with their backs facing the tree line. My father's military tent was to my left, while I had a small individual tent that barely fit me, and my 2 friends were in a tent to the right. The wind howled for about 30 to 60 minutes before it suddenly stopped. There were no more crickets, no more wind, no wildlife sounds at all. Even the stream seemed muffled. All we had was the faint glow of the embers in front of us. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I knew my father and friends were just as tense. I heard them shifting uncomfortably, and then the zipper of one of my friend's tents opened. Naturally, I unzipped mine to see what was happening. As soon as I stuck my head out, I saw my father emerging from his tent, holding a machete and staring intently at the tree line. One of my friends, his head poking out of the tent, asked if I had heard a sound. I hadn't heard anything. My heart was pounding too hard to hear much else. We both emerged halfway from our tents to see what my father was looking at, but all we could see was darkness. Then I heard it, faint and distant. Hello. It was coming from somewhere deep in the darkness of the forest. I saw my father tense up, standing with his machete, his eyes locked on the tree line. The voice called out again, "Hello." It didn't sound right. It was as if someone was trying to imitate a feminine voice. My father motioned for me to add more wood to the fire, which I reluctantly did. He took a step back, closer to the fire, and kept his eyes fixed on the woods. By this time, my other friend had also poked his head out, and the three of us, along with my father, were staring into the forest, unsure of what to expect. An hour passed without incident, and my father eventually sat on a large rock beside his tent, one leg crossed, the machete still in hand. My friends returned to their tents, but I stayed outside, tending to the fire while my father watched and waited. At some point I heard a rustling sound to our right, just beyond the light of the fire. My friend closest to me looked over, asking if I had said something. I hadn't spoken a word since leaving the tent. I told him to stay quiet, and as soon as I did, my father stood next to me, whispering for both of us to remain silent. Then we heard it again. "Come here," spoken in the same eerie, feminine voice as before. The three of us stood there, staring into the direction from which the voice had come. It felt surreal, as if time had stopped, and the only reality was the darkness in front of us. The voice didn't call out again, but we heard something moving deeper into the forest. It wasn't a heavy sound. It was more like something light, staggering away into the woods. That was the last time we heard it. Soon after, I assume it was close to dawn, the sounds of the forest slowly began to return. Crickets chirping, distant bird calls, and the soft rustle of the wind through the leaves. We all felt a strange relief, as if an oppressive weight had been lifted from our chests. We quickly packed up our tents, gathered our belongings, and started the trek back home. We were silent the entire way, each of us lost in our own thoughts, processing what had happened. Paranoia lingered as we walked, our senses heightened, but there were no further sounds or sights to disturb us. Once we reached my yard, my father broke the silence. "What we experienced never happened," he said firmly, his voice carrying a tone of finality, "and it would be best if none of us ever spoke about it." The fear on his face was unmistakable, as if he himself couldn't believe what had transpired. To this day, I still don't know what we encountered that night. Out of curiosity, I asked my aunt, who had grown up in the same area, whether she had ever experienced anything similar. She too was silent at first, before telling me in a hushed voice that we shouldn't have gone camping there, and that my father had been foolish to allow it. Since then, I have left the village and moved to another state, but I have come across similar stories from the southeastern region. People from various parts of Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela in particular, have mentioned experiences eerily reminiscent of what we encountered that night in the woods. My older sister, on the other hand, has always had a special sensitivity to the paranormal. Unlike her, the strangest thing I've ever experienced was hearing my name called in empty rooms. I've never seen anything myself, but she has shared several stories that can be quite frightening, especially the way she tells them. Her experiences have given me a deep respect for these phenomena. My mother, at one point, was involved with a man who knew many interesting places across the state where they lived. One of those places was a church located on top of a hill. It was said to have been built at the request of a famous priest, and legend had it that many of the workers did not live long due to exposure to toxic gases or coal. I am not well versed in all the details of the story, but I read online that there was a tradition where the groom was expected to carry his bride up the steps to the church to prove his true love. This might explain the unusual location of the church. When we arrived in the town, a soccer game was taking place nearby. My mother and her companion decided to watch from the hillside, while my sister and I chose to visit the church. As we approached, we first explored the back of the building, where there was a ruined structure that had once been a school. Some of the old floorboards were still intact, hinting at its former state. After exploring that area, we decided to enter the church. The door was ajar, held by a chain, and some furniture had been piled inside, likely to prevent entry. However, someone had made a gap wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, we met a family of 3, a father, mother, and son, who were also inspecting the site. Seeing them there made us feel more comfortable about entering. The pews were decorated with purple paper ribbons, stretched from one end to the other, suggesting that Easter celebrations had recently taken place. The paper did not seem too deteriorated. At the front of the church, where a statue of Christ had once stood, there was now only a dark outline marking its absence. Only a lone pulpit remained, with no table for the chalice or other ceremonial objects. To the right, there was a small room where the priest would have prepared for Mass. It was empty, with only 2 entrances, one leading into the church and another leading outside, secured by a chain and padlock. There wasn't much else inside, just a few forgotten pieces of furniture. As the family began to leave, only my sister and I remained inside. I wasn't paying much attention to her at the time. My focus was on climbing a platform above the front door, curious to see what lay up there. Just as I was about to start climbing, my sister called out to me, "Miguel, let's go with Mom. We'll come back later." When I turned around, she was already walking away without saying another word. I followed her, but as we descended the stairs, I asked if we could return to the platform later to see what was up there. That's when she revealed that she had seen a man in the small room. She had only caught a glimpse of a brown robe and part of a leg, as if he were watching us. At first, I doubted her story, but over the years, it became one of our most intriguing family anecdotes. Years later, while working at a convenience store, I came across a newspaper section about paranormal experiences. It mentioned people who had reportedly seen a monk in a brown robe at that same church. This confirmed what my sister had seen, making me realize that she truly possessed the ability to perceive things that I couldn't. Despite my interest in the paranormal, I have to admit there are experiences I'd prefer not to have myself. I was 16 years old when another strange experience took place. My father and I rarely went to church, but one Sunday, he decided it would be a good day to attend Mass. I had no choice but to accompany him. As we entered the church, I noticed that it was almost full, which was unusual because it was typically sparsely attended. We found seats near the back, close to the entrance. The Mass began normally. The priest stood at the altar, and the congregation listened attentively. Everything seemed ordinary, until something unusual happened. At first, when I saw it, I couldn't process what I was seeing. It was as if my mind refused to believe it. I don't know how to describe it clearly, but it was almost like seeing a cat scurrying across the altar, but in a form that was different, something unrecognizable. Then I realized I wasn't the only one watching. Others had also noticed a shadowy figure, dark and clearly visible, moving slowly across the altar. It had no identifiable source, no person, no object. It was just there. It moved almost as if it were crawling along the ground, without any defined feet, its form stretching across the altar floor. The congregation remained mostly silent. Some people crossed themselves, while others simply stood with their mouths open in shock. The shadow did not stop or seem to acknowledge anyone's presence. It continued moving forward, as if unaware or uninterested in the fact that others were witnessing it. The most unsettling part was its lack of features, no eyes, no mouth. The best way I can describe it is that it was like a man made of clay, but with a smoky texture that was almost transparent. I'm sorry if this explanation isn't clear. It's hard to put such an experience into words. The figure moved a few meters before it began to dissolve, as if it were evaporating into the air. Its body seemed to merge with the surroundings until it completely disappeared. The priest, who had paused the mass momentarily, appeared surprised but not frightened. He calmly asked us to pray, not for ourselves, but for the soul that had decided to visit us. I wasn't sure how to interpret his reaction. Maybe his devout worldview made him less fearful, or perhaps he simply wanted to maintain the congregation's composure. For years I didn't consider myself a particularly religious person, but that event changed something in me. It was a stark reminder that there are aspects of our world that remain beyond our understanding, and it confirmed for me that reality is more complex than we often assume. The experiences with my grandmother, my mother, and the mysterious figures I'd encountered were more than enough to shape my perspective on the supernatural. Even though I was still skeptical at times, I had developed a sense of reverence for the unknown, a feeling that transcended fear. Over the years, I've come to realize that these events are not just isolated stories. They seem to be part of a larger tapestry, woven from the beliefs and experiences of generations before me. Each encounter, whether with shadows, voices, or eerie visions, feels like a fragment of a deeper truth, one that has been passed down, whispered, and witnessed, yet never fully understood. Despite all of this, I continue to wonder what lies beyond these encounters. Are they merely glimpses of another reality, or are they reflections of something buried within us, brought to life by fear, faith, or both? Whatever the answer may be, I've come to accept that some things cannot be explained, only experienced. And perhaps that is the real lesson of all these tales, that the unknown, while unsettling, is also a part of life, a reminder that there is always more to learn, more to see, and more to question. Years went by, and I often found myself reflecting on these experiences. My grandmother's haunted house, my mother's dreams, and the strange shadow in the church. As I got older, I began to understand that these events were not just stories or isolated incidents. They were part of a much larger, interconnected reality that shaped my family's history and, in many ways, my own understanding of the world. When I was in my early 20s, I moved to a different state, hoping for a fresh start. The small haunted village of my childhood felt distant, almost like a memory from another life. I thought that leaving behind the familiar landscapes and eerie stories would allow me to create a more ordinary life. But the more I tried to distance myself from my past, the more I realized that the supernatural was not limited by geography. It seemed to follow me, manifesting itself in unexpected ways. One evening, while living in a modest apartment in the city, I experienced another unsettling encounter. I had just settled into bed when I heard a faint whisper. It was unclear at first, almost like a soft breeze, but then I recognized it, my name, spoken in a low, raspy voice. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding, and strained to hear more. But the whisper didn't return, leaving me in the dark, unsure whether it had been real or merely a figment of my imagination. Despite my skepticism, the feeling of being watched persisted. It was as if the walls themselves were alive with the echoes of old stories, stories that had traveled with me, even as I tried to leave them behind. I couldn't help but wonder whether the supernatural was, in some way, intertwined with my family's past, a legacy that was inescapable, no matter how far I roamed. This sense of inevitability became even clearer when I visited an old friend who was deeply involved in the study of the paranormal. His name was Victor, and he had dedicated much of his life to understanding the unexplained. During our conversation, I shared my experiences with him, from the haunting tales of my grandmother's house to the strange occurrences I'd witnessed over the years. Victor listened intently, his eyes sharp and focused. When I finished, He leaned back thoughtfully and said, "It sounds like you're dealing with more than just one haunting. What you describe is a web of connected events, possibly tied to a single source." "A single source?" I asked, intrigued by the idea. He nodded. "Yes, a central entity that has influenced your family across generations. It's possible that your grandmother's house was just the starting point, a gateway, if you will. The spirits or entities you've encountered may be drawn to your family specifically, following you through time and space." I found the concept both fascinating and terrifying. Could it be that the paranormal events in my life were not random, but part of a larger pattern, tied to some unresolved spiritual conflict? Victor suggested that I undergo a cleansing ritual, a process meant to break any lingering connections to the spirits that might be following me. Reluctantly, I agreed, curious to see if it would have any effect. The ritual involved the use of sacred herbs, candles, and a series of prayers meant to purify both the body and the soul. It was conducted in Victor's dimly lit apartment, the air thick with the scent of burning sage and incense. As the ceremony progressed, I felt a strange sensation, a mix of warmth and tingling that started at the base of my spine and spread throughout my body. Victor's voice was steady as he recited the prayers, his tone growing more commanding with each word. "Release this soul from the grip of the past," he intoned. "Let the spirits be at peace, and let the living be free." I closed my eyes, focusing on the energy that seemed to fill the room. It was as if the space itself was shifting, as if the air had become charged with an invisible presence. Suddenly I felt a burst of cold air, and an overwhelming sense of relief washed over me. It was as though a weight had been lifted, a burden I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. When the ritual ended, Victor looked at me with a mix of curiosity and satisfaction. "Do you feel different?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Yes, I do. It's hard to explain, but I feel lighter, as if something that was holding on to me has finally let go." He smiled. "That's a good sign. But remember, the supernatural is complex. Even if this ritual has helped, it's not a permanent solution. The spirits might return, especially if there are unresolved issues or deep-seated connections." His words lingered in my mind long after I left his apartment. I knew he was right. The supernatural world is not one that can be neatly tied up or completely banished. It's fluid, shifting, and often unpredictable. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of closure, however temporary it might be. As I walked home that night, the city streets felt less foreboding. The shadows seemed less threatening, and the whispering winds carried a sense of peace rather than dread. It was a small victory, but a significant one, a reminder that, even in a world filled with darkness and mystery, there is always a light to be found, however dim or fleeting. The supernatural, I realized, was not just a force to fear, but also a force to understand. It was a part of my heritage, a legacy of stories, whispers, and shadows that had shaped my family, and, in turn, had shaped me.